please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
We are discussing liquidity for infrastructure projects, and as one of our experts explained, there is a lot of liquidity in Mumbai city today. To welcome all of us. Thank you very much for braving all that liquidity and coming to what is quite clearly the most important session of the AIIB's second annual meeting, which is being held in Mumbai. The theme of this panel, and I consider that the most important, mobilizing finance for infrastructure. And this is how it is laid out. We have with us two prominent representatives of two Asian countries, India and Indonesia, to tell us what governors feel in terms of the problem of infrastructure financing. And we have three finance providers to tell us how those problems can be resolved from their point of view. Before I introduce my very distinguished panel, just a word on the theme that we are discussing. One estimate of the total infrastructure needs for Asian countries in a single year is $1.3 trillion, of which the governments and the multilateral banks are able to provide about half from their balance sheets. How do you get the other half? That's the question this panel is trying to tackle. And let me quickly introduce the guests we have, the host country and the person perhaps extremely qualified to speak on the issue, Mr. Piyush Goyal. Mr. Piyush Goyal, of course, has been already handling a lot of infrastructure ministries. He has been Minister of Power and Coal and now Minister of Railways and standing in as Minister of Finance at the moment. So I think most qualified to talk about both finance and infrastructure. And I must also add that Mr. Goyal is a chartered accountant by profession and therefore already knows what kind of problems. He has been at the boards of several banks, so clearly understands what kind of problems finance faces to come into infrastructure and infrastructure faces to attract finance. We also have with us Professor Bambang Brojo Negoro, of the Minister of Planning from Indonesia. He has also handled the Ministry of Finance. So once again, eminently capable of handling both infrastructure and finance. And from the financing side, let me begin with Mr. Piyush Gupta, the name I confused. Mr. Piyush Gupta, CEO, DBS Group. Again, someone who has handled both retail banking and infrastructure or commercial finance, and has a long stint, several years in Citibank before he became the head of DBS. We have Dr. Hajar, who is from the Islamic Development Bank. Dr. Hajar is both an academic and a practicing financier now, so can bring to bear so many issues that academia is trying to solve and bring to a board in terms of policy making. And of course, we have the host of the seminar, Mr. Chin Lee Chun. I hope I got the pronunciation right. Mr. Chin Lee Chun, who of course heads AIIB and therefore is coming with a lot of ideas on how we can finance infrastructure. Well, with that introduction, let me begin with the host. Mr. Goyal, partly because you're, of course, best placed to speak about this problem. Tell us what has been India's experience in terms of finding money and exactly what the problem is in getting private capital into infrastructure financing.
Well, at the outset, Lata, let me welcome all the delegates who have come in from different countries to my home city of Mumbai. We're delighted to have all of you here, and I hope you have a comfortable stay and enjoy the rain as much as Lata and I do.
Yes.
I think, to my mind, infrastructure today is one of the most important and engaging subjects when it comes to planning for the future of Asia. Different estimates about what is required to be done. You did highlight the problem between the world of finance and the world of infrastructure. But it's somewhat like a marriage. It has to be a little rocky in the beginning. It goes through its stages of maturing. And once projects are in line, you have all the requisite approvals, regulatory processes in place, land, finances tied up, then it becomes a smoother ride. And ultimately, when the entire project is complete, then it's joyous because it can transform lives. And to my mind, the infrastructure story in most countries, I'm sure the Western world would have gone through that at some point of time, and Asia today is experiencing that. We in India have seen the development of infrastructure actually transform lives, actually help us go towards meeting the aspirational goals of 1 billion people. And for that, what's most critical to attract private capital or even to attract multilateral finance companies to come into India is going to be a predictable, a very stable policy regime.
Yes.
It has to be simple. It has to be easy to navigate. It has to be truly long-lasting. You can't change the rules of the game as you go along. And to my mind, something which President Jin and I discussed yesterday, integrity of processes and integrity of individuals running those processes, both sides of the table, truly will define the availability of finance. There was a time when the entire Asian continent has gone through periods where people distrusted governments and distrusted the processes that went through the process of awarding contracts for infrastructure. Indonesia has faced that period, India has faced that period. You can't have a situation where you have projects which have licenses subsequently getting cancelled, leading to a lot of distress to international investors or even domestic investors. So you will end up facing a situation where private capital will run away if it has to be faced with the legal issues or problems subsequent to contracts being finalized. It will also take away investors and private and public finances. I think that has been one of the most important elements of the change that we are witnessing today. A, the change in governments and governance practices. B, also the change in the mindset of the people of the country. There's a lot more accountability demanded. There's a lot more monitoring of the work you have taken if something goes wrong. Action which is decisive, action which is visible. Therefore, I don't feel any great pressure that we will have a problem of finance when we are doing the massive rollout of infrastructure in India in the coming years. Different estimates are made. We believe we'll need about $4.5 trillion over the next 10 years at the minimum. Important challenges will be the cost of that finance, both equity and debt. Another important challenge will be to create the availability of local resources, build up capacity to actually implement this level of projects. And I'm sure with the support of organizations like the AIIB, which are bringing in very high quality standards, high integrity standards, and supporting also countries like India develop these processes, I would not think that finance will be a deterrence to the creation of the infrastructure India requires.
Okay, that's good to hear if you're confident that finance will come. But yes, I think the minister has put in the very important issues that private finance will face, especially if, you know, decisions taken are revoked by a subsequent court or by a subsequent administration. That will be the big thing that India has learned the hard way. Professor Bambang, on the same lines, what has been Indonesia's experience so far in terms of attracting private capital to infrastructure and generally finding money for infrastructure?
Yeah, I think in general I agree with Minister Goyal about, you know, the issue of strong regulatory framework as well as the certainty for the business. In the issue of certainty, of course, I don't know about other countries, but in Indonesia, we used to have, I think, a very critical issue for private investor, which is land acquisition. So whenever they have the interest to build the infrastructure project, sometimes their project is disrupted by the land acquisition issue. So that's the reason why the government trying to put the emphasis more on the land acquisition, just to create certainty. On top of those issues, I think one critical issue for private sector investment in infrastructure is the readiness or availability of so-called feasible projects. Of course, we know that there are a lot of long-term financing everywhere in the world. And then there are the needs of the developing countries to build the infrastructure. But sometimes when we are trying to attract private sector, we are not ready to provide, let's say, a good feasibility study that makes any potential infrastructure projects bankable. Because I believe any private investor only interested with the bankable projects because they need to get some debt financing. So sometimes we ignore. We always say that we have huge potential, we need a toll road, we need power plant, we need airport, seaport, but when it comes to the detail, which is a feasibility study, we don't have, quite solid feasibility study.
Multilateral organizations like yours, instead of giving a large amount of money to few projects, can you give small amounts to many projects? But the covenant should be that the private capital which comes in should have the advantage of cross default. That is, if the project defaults to the private capital, it is also a default on the MDB. If that covenant is written, governments will be a little wary of allowing that default because they don't like to default with MDBs. And therefore, private capital will be happy to come in. They will feel enthused to come in. So I want reactions from everybody, if you all can, and then we will proceed to other questions. Does this work for a multilateral bank? And then, of course, to the ministers, whether there will be a buy-in from the sovereign for an idea like this. Your reaction to this idea and any others?
My reaction is dangerous.
Oh, okay.
You scale away both the public and private sector.
Okay.
I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but I think it's very hard. It's very much complicated. The private sector companies operate by their own standards, and the public sector have their own standards. I think the best way is to work out some kind of a mechanism in which, for instance, we can facilitate the PPP. And with regard to the MDBs, we are working very well with all of the MDBs. Now, even though we do not have yet real projects, but the chemistry between the Islamic Development Bank and our bank is developing. And then when we start to invest in many African countries, the first African country is Egypt. We already invested. So I think we can do big ticket projects.
Okay.
For the smaller ones, my idea is to support the smaller ones and in a cost-effective way. We can invest in private equity funds. They reach out.
Okay.
They reach out to do something we cannot do. Draw an analogy. If you have a big container, you throw in big rocks in it. Very quickly, it seems like the container is filled, which is not. And you have to pour in small rocks and even sands to completely fill the container. That's why big companies, smaller companies need to work together to achieve their maximum development impact. So it's dangerous. I'm sorry, Atia. Don't try to do this. If you want to work together, that's fine. But I'm not. I'm not going to do it.
I do think, when I said the multilateral development organizations have a role, I think the real trick is to see how we can lever the capacities of the MDBs to get much more exponential impact by crowding in. And whether you call it cross-default or you call it first loss.
First loss.
I think a first loss provision allows you to get much bigger scale for whatever risk and capital commitment the MDBs make. Now, there have been some experiences and experiments. The ADB's tried this. I think most of Europe's wind sector has benefited very enormously from a first loss kind of program. The other thing MDBs can do is actually diversify across projects. Take a pool of projects, issue paper against it, and diversify. Now, there's an IFC program which is actually achieves both. So it's their, what do they call it? IFC's Managed Co-Lending Portfolio Program, MCBP, where they actually put together a pool of projects, they take first loss, and then they actually securitize the pool to be able to get diversified investors to come in at a next level. So it gives you the ability to take first loss at a level, get some scale,
That was what
as well as diversification. And I do think there's some merit in exploring situations of that sort.
Okay. Will you bite? If they come with a cross-default clause,
Well, I think both are right in different projects. I fully agree with President Jin that we cannot have MDBs getting into very high-risk projects and defaulting. They're ultimately going back to the sovereign. It's most of the sovereigns who are the principal promoters or financiers. And the day we'll have MDBs failing, or even a single MDB having a stress on their balance sheet, it'll actually shake the international financial system very badly. So we will have to continue to have the MDBs who provide relatively lower cost financing, focus on very strong projects, very often insisting on sovereign guarantees, or very safe projects. And all of us must collectively try and strengthen their balance sheets and strengthen the future. They have a big role to play in the international
But if they say
financing.
that I'm providing 10% and the private sector is providing 40%.
I'll come to the first loss issue. I think it very much depends on the nature of project and the country we are dealing with. You rightly said that India has a very robust framework on inflation control and the fiscal responsibility. In fact, even when this was not there, if you look at the last 27 years, post 1991, Indian rupee has not depreciated more than 3 or 3.1%
average
CAGR over the last 27 years. So we may have had certain ebbs and dips and stuff like that, but by and large in the long term, we've been a very stable currency and a stable country to invest in. And possibly that encourages me to think in terms of whether the sovereign, as Mr. Gupta rightly said, should engage with some kind of a comfort to investors on foreign currency long-term risks. We actually could consider doing that. It's not a bad idea at all.
One final interaction from you, Professor Bambang, and I want to invite the audience to ask questions. Anything you want from the multilateral guys?
Yeah.
They have told you what they want.
Yeah, I think I can share two examples from Indonesia PPP regarding a possibility of MDB participation in the PPP. It means that they have to work together with the private sector. I think there was one toll road project in Indonesia, outside Java, which is away from the major urban road, a major urban area, in which the IRR would not be attractive enough for private investors if they have to use their own financing. So government step in by getting the loan from a government-backed agency, which is foreign government, China in this case, and then government, let's say, build one section of the whole toll road. Let's say the toll road has all the 3 sections. Government built the one section. So by having this one section, it will improve the IRR for the private sector. So they can complete the rest of the 2 sections. And at the end, they manage all the toll roads. All the revenue will go to the companies. So that could be one possibility.
We as MDBs, I look at the problem is not just finance. Finance is just one component of the problems. We have to deliver with finance, building capacity building. We have to strengthen the regulations in our member countries. We have to help them in transforming the economy from one state to others. So if we look at just finance by itself, this will not solve the problems.
Of course.
The second thing is money is there. We don't have a problem with the money, as I mentioned earlier. But we have to build, as MDBs, our ability to mitigate the risk. And our member countries also, now they are getting more mature. They have to create the enabling environment, enable to make the private sector to invest in these countries.
Well, we are timed out, but the key learning from this panel is the MDBs would like the governments, the sovereign governments, to have a single window where they can get their issues addressed, not just at the policy level, but as all our participants said, at the execution level, something that's being done, but perhaps that could be an important learning. And from the point of view of the people who are seeking investment, the MDBs could have more cooperation between one another And more importantly, if you can draw up a list of do's and don'ts. So I wouldn't call it code of conduct. That sounds too dictatorial, something which sovereign governments will not take. But a recommended list of do's and don'ts so that sovereign governments have an idea what MDBs expect.